kick right now. Starting to stream on Twitch right now. Here we are. We are live.
Welcome back to Mystery School Dropouts, where we explore the fringe, the obscure, and the esoteric in our search for the truth. Today we're diving into one of the most enduring mysteries of our time, evidence of alien life. From the cryptic beauty of crop circles to the strange blip of the WOW signal, to the high-flying accounts of Commander David Fravor and the controversial claims of Bob Lazar and his mysterious Element 115. We'll be examining the more tangible signs that we might not be alone in the universe.
Well said. Well said. I'm very excited to get into this topic. Obviously, it is a very large topic, universally large, literally. So we're going to try and focus in more on some specific things. We will probably come back to explore more about this topic at a later point. But as Alex mentioned, we will discuss those things. So how do we want to begin? Let's start with crop circles. Someone else want to take this one away? This was not my area of focus.
Yeah, so crop circles, everyone knows essentially what they are. They're pretty ubiquitous in our Western culture. But they're essentially this phenomenon that is a series of strange shapes that are found in fields of farmers. They popped up a lot in the mid 20th century. Alex, I think we talked about this earlier, but I think you have some links to older instances of this happening in like the 1800s.
Yeah, I
But
think the
essentially,
first one was actually from the 1600s. It was kind of interesting. It was the first time it was ever recorded.
yeah,
But yeah, they thought it was the devil doing it back then.
as with many things, I'm sure. But crop circles, as we understand them today, really became a phenomenon in the 1980s. That's when it really like took off. And again, it's these really intricately shaped what seem like symbols that are found in farmers' fields. It happened a lot in the United Kingdom. It's happened in the United States and other parts of the world, and they tend to be very large. So if you on my stream, I have photographs here, aerial perspectives of these. You'll see a lot of hexagonal shapes, circles, triangles, and they were just appearing out of nowhere. Particularly, again, like I said, in the 1980s, without much rhyme or reason. It seemed they were just manifesting all across the United Kingdom, in particular. And a lot of people began to suspect that they were of extraterrestrial origin. They began to connect it with UFO sightings in the areas, and a lot of people believed that this was some sort of communication effort between extraterrestrial beings and humans. I don't want to linger too much on this particular facet of the conversation because, largely speaking, this has been debunked. It was actually, and I have the article up here, it was two gentlemen in the 1980s in a pub their names are David Chorley and Douglas Bauer. They came up with this idea in 1978, drinking in a Hampshire pub, and they proceeded to sneak all over the United Kingdom for many years into random farmers' fields and would create these things using a plank that they would have connected with two ropes where they would be able to bend the crops over without breaking them. And they would create all these intricate designs. It created a media frenzy, and these two blokes would just sit back and laugh as this phenomenon started like catching crazy media wildfire, and then other people started doing it too, and it started to spread all over the world and became this big phenomenon. But largely speaking, these two particular dudes are responsible for this becoming a big talking point in extraterrestrial topics. Although, again, to reiterate, today I think it's largely kind of tossed to the side. Although, and again, I think I was talking to you, Alex, about this. There were some instances that don't have anything to do with these two gentlemen of crop circles that had higher degrees of radiation, like ambient radiation in the area. Am I accurate in saying this?
Yeah, I saw that as well. And I was reading an article, I think it was from Physics World, where I'm not sure if he was a biologist or what his expertise was, but he claimed that people were using microwaves to actually bend the corn stalks. So if you think about the way that Chops just described, where there's people walking around, with a board and some string and kind of tamping the crops down, what's going to happen is those stalks are going to break as they bend over. So this person was claiming that there were actually microwaves used, and these were to heat the stalks up to make them more malleable. So instead of breaking, they would bend. And of course, if you look at a crop circle or you're, studying this, it just adds an extra level of complexity to how it was made. So it makes people who are looking at these things even more skeptical and thinking, this actually could be aliens, because this isn't normally how crops would bend or break. So it adds just this extra layer to it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will say that would not explain why they would find higher levels of radiation in these areas. And I'm curious if there's any legitimacy to that claim, if there has been some redundant research or testing done in order to verify that that was the case. And if it is, that would be an even more sophisticated level of dedication to this bit. It would mean that someone would have to introduce small amounts, in controlled amounts that would not kill a person. They would have to get their hands on something radioactive and then disperse it amongst these crop circles at levels that would not be super harmful, but would be enough to raise a flag if somebody did that kind of testing. It is interesting. I'm curious, like I said, if there is any legitimacy to those tests. I just glanced over an article. I didn't read deeply into it about it, but it did pique my interest. I mean, it could signify that something more is going on, if that is in fact the case. But I'm not sure.
I don't think it would be ridiculous either to think that somebody would maybe like lace a field with some type of radioactive material. I mean, it would be fairly easy to get it in small amounts. I mean, there's like if you think about like fire alarms, or not alarms, but fire detectors, for instance, contain some radioactive material in them. There's a story, you guys should look it up sometime, about somebody actually building a nuclear reactor with a bunch of, fire detector radioactive material. So it wouldn't be crazy for somebody to get a hold of it and do it. And just like using microwaves to bend the stalks, if you can add any signs that this was created by aliens to your crop circle, you get extra props and you get more media attention. So it makes sense that people would, be kind of rewarded for going to these crazy efforts to kind of make it look real.
Right. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about, if, let's say, this is in fact, some crop circles are actually created by extraterrestrial life. What do we speculate the purpose of them doing this would be? You would think that if they would want to communicate with us, if that was their intention, that they have much more sophisticated ways, if they've managed to make it all the way to our specific solar system and enter our atmosphere, they surely have technology that is adequate to communicate with us in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fun to think about this because there's so many diverging paths that sprout from this. I mean, one would be, and this a simple one, that they aren't necessarily for us. Maybe they're communicating amongst themselves, leaving some sort of symbol that is completely like unknown to us, but they're communicating amongst themselves about certain aspects of our planet. I don't know.
Okay,
That
M.
could
Night
be.
Shyamalan.
But that could be one thing, right? That's one thing that
Right.
popped into my head right away. Would be like, oh, these symbols aren't even for us. They're not trying to talk to us. They're talking to each other.
Hmm.
They could be fucking with us. That's a stupid answer, but I mean, who knows, right? They could just be memeing us. Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, when you really give it a little bit of scrutiny, it seems like a very absurdist approach if you were trying to communicate with a species from another planet. This seems like a very odd way to go about it. If they have the means to have vehicles of some sort visit us, I think there would be innumerable more practical ways of attempting to communicate with human beings than smushing corn stalks in intricate patterns in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
Right?
I would agree.
Right.
I think one
Okay.
interesting thought to have, and I have kind of seen this online, and I'm not saying that I, think that this is true, obviously. But if aliens wanted to let us know they were here, but they didn't want to do it in a super overt way where they're going to scare us, what would be a way for them to do that? And maybe later on in the podcast, we'll talk about, what we would do or how we would feel if we knew aliens were here. But this seems like a way that if you assume that they are communicating through crop circles, that it's a way to do it in a not very scary manner. It's kind of like easing us into the idea, so to speak.
Right. It's an interesting thought. However, I feel like it's making a lot of assumptions, like the fact that some sort of extraterrestrial civilization would have some sort of awareness of how we would emotionally respond to things. I mean, we don't even know if they if there are other beings, if they feel in the same way, if they even, see the world in the same way. And, you know, that would imply that they function similarly to us in terms of how they think, and they also have an understanding of us on a level that would allow them to make that kind of decision. Seems like a stretch to me.
Yeah, I could see that, but I also don't think that them being able to predict everything about us is that absurd. If you assume that they're how many millions of years ahead of us, predicting our reaction to something, seems like might be a pretty easy thing for them to do. But I do agree, it does take a lot of assumptions and a lot of kind of mental gymnastics to to make this work. But it's just an interesting thought. I can't really come up with
Mhm.
any other reason why they would use crop circles. It just
Right.
it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right.
And when you combine all of what was just said with the fact that uh, the peak of the phenomenon has been pinpointed to two dudes who were pulling a very elaborate prank. I think that kind of illustrates why it's no longer so much of a talking point when we're discussing UFOs and UAPs.
Right.
It's just not. I personally get the sense that this is not part of that zeitgeist anymore. It's
Mhm.
something that is very 20th century that we kind of chuckle at now. I will
Right.
say, as an aside, in a weird roundabout way that I'm sure they couldn't have even predicted, it really did bloom this cool artistic movement of sorts, where people still do it for fun as an artistic endeavor, and
And
a
it is
lot of them.
impressive as such.
It
It is
is.
impressive.
It's very impressive, and I just think it's worth saying that if anyone who is listening and is interested in looking into this more, like really dig a bit and look at some of the artists that have created like increasingly more complex and grander crop circles that are quite beautiful sometimes.
Mhm.
Pretty cool.
And even
But
have some
yeah.
complex messages within them. Some of them have binary code. Some of them use like glyphs and other things. So there is definitely a lot of thought and energy put into these.
Hmm.
Yeah, they're very
So
impressive.
Hmm.
yeah, absolutely. But as far as having any sort of extraterrestrial origin, I personally write this one off
Mhm.
pretty roundly.
I would tend to agree.
Yep.
Yeah.
So let's move on to some potentially more interesting facets of this topic. The wow signal. Chops, I believe this was one of your focuses as well.
Yeah, I looked into it a little bit, and it is a very curious and interesting phenomenon that occurred. It was recorded on August 15th, 1977. It was noticed by an astronomer named Jerry Ehman. I hope I'm saying his name right. Ehman. It was captured by, drum roll, it is, I believe, the Big Ear. Is that the name of the?
Yeah, I think that's
Yes.
correct.
Thank you. Thank you. I should have had that in my notes already. But it was a 72-second long signal that was a narrowband radio signal that was picked up on the Big Ear telescope. Are you raising your hand? Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the reason it was 72 seconds is because the Big Ear telescope, the telescopes of that era were not technologically advanced to the point where they were able to move around to focus on a specific signal. And that 72 seconds was the time period during which, because of the Earth's rotation and the placement of the telescope, it was positioned to intercept that signal. So the signal could have been longer. We're just not sure because 72 seconds is the amount of time that the telescope was facing the signal.
Mm-hmm. Right, and one of the things what makes it so notable is the level of intensity of the signal was just like far beyond anything else that was being recorded by like several factors on this band. Like it was an extremely irregular signal that was only recorded this one time and has not been repeated since. And a lot of people believe that it might be extraterrestrial in origin, that because of how anomalous it is and because of what seems like the deliberate intensity of the signal. A lot of people believe it's of extraterrestrial origin. Based on what I've read, I wrote down a little bit here of what seems like the most likely explanation today. It seems like it could have been caused by a flare from a magnetar hitting a cold hydrogen cloud in space. So, a magnetar is a hypermagnetized neutron star that has a magnetic field that is like trillions of times stronger than our ionosphere. And what people are thinking today really happened is that magnetar triggered a rare event called a stimulated emission in the surrounding hydrogen cloud. So essentially, that process would have caused the hydrogen cloud nearby to glow brightly in the radio wavelength, and that would have created a tightly focused beam of microwave radiation. And the Big Ear telescope detected this outburst. That's the leading theory right now, like the most rationally explained one. And it's also the reason why it would explain why we haven't seen another one since, because so many things had to kind of align perfectly for such an event to be picked up by us. So like the hydrogen cloud would have had to have been in a very particular like level of density. You get the idea. Essentially, it was this extremely like unlikely event that we happened to be pointed in the right direction. And we caught it.
Yeah,
Alex.
I think that this one's interesting. I mean, originally, I think you covered it pretty well, but originally the reason they thought that it was, actually like an extraterrestrial communication was because of how narrow the frequency or the band that it was on, that it was broadcasted on was. So typically when you're observing like natural phenomenon, from a radio perspective, it's not so neatly broadcast. This was broadcast in a very specific frequency. It wasn't, didn't cover a lot of bandwidth. It was very specific and very kind of pinpoint. But I think, yeah, as you said, I think hydrogen plays a big, factor in this. It's interesting. I watched a YouTube video where a guy actually did the math on this, and he was able to, I don't want to say prove, but he speculated that it was actually the frequency of the hydrogen line, which it was, and maybe Brandon can tell us a little bit more about exactly what the hydrogen line is. But there's one other kind of aspect to it. So it's the actual broadcast that came through wasn't directly on the hydrogen line; it was slightly off. And so what scientists had figured is that the broadcast had actually been blue shifted. So that meant, I believe, that this phenomenon was traveling toward us. So that, because of the Doppler effect, that would actually make the frequency slightly different than just the base hydrogen line frequency. So it seems like a pretty easy kind of way to just do math on this thing and figure out exactly what it was.
Right. And I just wanted to, expound a bit more about the significance of the fact that it was within the hydrogen line band. So the reason it is significant is that obviously hydrogen being a very simple atom consisting of typically one proton, one neutron, it is the most abundant element in the universe. And it is speculated that the reason, if someone were to send out a radio signal for the purpose of communication, that they would use the hydrogen line, is that it acts as the most likely listening band for any civilization that has developed the scientific capability to measure radio frequencies. The hydrogen line exists, just to give a little bit of scientific background, because protons in the hydrogen nucleus, when they change their spin direction, they emit radio waves at this frequency, which is like 14 something megahertz. I forget what it is. So that, would be a likely reason that if an extraterrestrial civilization were to want to communicate with others out there, the hydrogen line would be a good candidate as a band to broadcast on, because of the prevalence of hydrogen and this hydrogen line throughout the universe. It's kind of a universal background for listening on radio frequencies if the purpose is communication, which is interesting and cool.
Right. Right.
And I imagine if we were to try and communicate in this way, we would probably think a similar way, in that we would want to broadcast on this band because of the significance.
So given all of that, a lot of people over the decades have attributed this to an extraterrestrial signal. The intensity of it, the specificity of it, the singularity of it, all of these factors kind of combine to potentially suggest, like, oh, maybe it really is someone out there trying to get in contact with us. But my aforementioned explanation, I think, feels pretty compelling. The like a flare from a magnetar passing through the hydrogen cloud excites the hydrogen molecules, creates this focused beam that we just happen to pick up. It's an incredibly rare event in and of itself, but it does have a precedent. We know it happens, and the fact that we happened to capture it at that moment was just call it a stroke of luck. Right? I mean,
yeah, definitely. It is really interesting. I really wish that this would have happened like 10 years later. Well, we would have had so much more information. We would have been able to keep track of it for longer, potentially pinpoint its its general source location. But it is interesting. It is interesting. And, you know, in terms of attributing it to something natural that's extremely rare, it almost makes me think that it's as likely to attribute it to a natural phenomenon as it is to a intentional phenomenon because of the scope, the size, the sheer size of the universe, and the sheer likelihood that there are other intelligent beings in the universe. So my science brain definitely wants to put it to some natural phenomenon, it could very well be another civilization trying to communicate. We'll get into this, I think, a bit later in some of our post discussion.
Yeah,
But my biggest thing is trying to think about why another civilization would send out a message in this way. And I'm not going to go into it now since I have a limit on how many times I can talk about the 3-body problem. But I have more to say.
Yeah. I don't want to come off like I'm poo-pooing it. Regardless of what the origin is, WoW is certainly an appropriate moniker for it. Whether it's a natural phenomenon or if it's something extraterrestrial. Obviously, I think it's part of the whole theme of this podcast is to view everything with an air of skepticism. So, if there is a likely natural explanation for any of these things, I'm going to lean towards that. But go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. I just wanted to make a quick comment because we haven't actually explained why it is called the WoW signal, I don't think.
Oh yeah.
When scientists this data at the time was coming out on actual sheets of paper. And when they noticed this aberration in the radio bands that we mentioned, they circled it and wrote "wow" next to it, and therefore it is henceforth known as the WoW signal. So,
yeah, thank you. I actually have it up on my stream right now, and the letter and number sequence is 6EQUJ5. And to give a little more context, level of intensity is usually only described in numbers. If you look at the rest of what was happening on this band, it's like the numbers are 1, 3, 2, a lot more ones. Letters, nothing normally comes out in letters apparently in this band. So the fact that we have EQUJ is like something incredibly strong because starting alphabetically too. So A would be 10, I think. I believe is how they're structuring it.
I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Yeah. So the fact that we have letters like Q and U on here means like this was an incredibly loud, strong, intense signal. So wow, indeed. But yeah.
Yeah, imagine being the researcher who was there in the lab, just just listening all day long. You've been there for 20 years and you haven't heard a single damn thing. And all of a sudden, something comes across.
Yeah,
the
pretty wild.
excitement,
Oh man!
If you want to see this thought out, watch the movie Contact. It's a great film, and the main character works on radio antennas for the purpose of trying to catch communications from extraterrestrial civilizations, and it's a great film. Highly recommend.
Seconded.
Yep. Okay. Anything else about the WoW signal before we move on? Nope.
No, I think that
All
covers
right.
it.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's dive into the infamous Robert Lazar. For those who are unfamiliar with Robert, aka Bob Lazar, he claims to be an MIT graduate who, through kind of sheer chance, ended up working at the S4 Top Secret Research Facility, which is a branch of the main Area 51 research facility in Nevada. He claims that the government called upon him because they saw in the newspaper that he had fitted his Honda with a jet engine and was capable of reaching 200 miles an hour with it, therefore exemplifying his engineering prowess and, I guess, qualifying him to go work on what he claims to have worked on at S4, which is the reverse engineering of captured alien spacecraft. Now, Bob Lazar is a very interesting character because a lot of his background is questioned by many. His school background, his collegiate records are questioned by people. It's been very difficult to track down any record of him attending any of the schools that he claims to have attended. And his claim to fame is that he, after working at this facility, came out and made public what he experienced or claims to have experienced there. He claims that the U.S. government had 9 UFOs in their possession. Chops, do you have something to add real quick?
Yeah, I just have a quick question for you.
Mhm.
Because I haven't looked as deeply into him, so I'm curious. It sounds like his claims of college education are dubious, based on what you're saying. Should it not be straightforward to just approach the college and they could just confirm or deny whether or not he attended or got a degree with them? Is that
Now, this is an interesting question because, yes, you are correct. However, some people believe that there is actually that the colleges are in collusion with the United States government as means to squash his legitimacy saying these things.
I
Obviously,
see.
it is in the government's interest to prevent him from disclosing top secret information, which, if he is in fact truthful about what he's saying, is exactly what he is doing. So, yeah,
I see.
going
So,
through like proper rigor, trying to research, like trying to dive into his background, you would think it would be quite easy. It seems that going through those means, no one has really been able to verify his background. They have tracked down teachers he claims to have interacted with, and this one in particular, I don't recall his name. He claims to have worked with, I believe, at MIT. I could be wrong, but I believe at
no,
MIT.
you're correct. You're correct.
Okay. Yeah, there was a professor he claims to have worked with at MIT who he mentions everyone should go ask him. And when this professor was tracked down, it was found that he had never been a professor at MIT. He worked at a completely different institution. And I believe, if I recall correctly, he said that he was a high school teacher for Bob Lazar.
I
I
believe
could
that's
be wrong about
correct.
that. Yeah. So,
Mm.
but right, you gotta wonder, the fingers of the government are very long and very persuasive. So, if there was in fact some conspiratorial uh something at play here on behalf of the government to try and suppress Bob Lazar, it's ostensible that they could have you paid this guy off, or even potentially threatened him to deny Bob Lazar's claims.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Interesting.
but anyways, Bob Lazar came forward and told the public that he had worked on reverse engineering of an extraterrestrial craft, and that the US had 9 of them in their possession. He goes into great detail about the workings of the craft, how the reactors work, how they are powered, how they are able to bypass the speed of light and traverse through the universe almost instantaneously. It gets into the weeds, but the basic concept that he talks about is an anti-gravity drive, which allows the craft to bend space-time and essentially create a wormhole. So if you imagine space-time like a flat sheet of paper, it would be like something being able to bend that piece of paper so opposite ends of the paper are touching. And therefore, you could instantaneously travel from one end of the paper to the other, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that space-time, at least according to the theory of general relativity posed by Einstein, does seem to work in this manner, and wormholes like this are theoretically possible. We have obviously no technological basis to verify this yet, and we honestly still, our understanding of physics is still to the point where we honestly aren't even sure that the standard accepted definition of Einstein's general relativity is the correct theory for how gravity works. It is still quite a mystery to us. But Bob Lazar says that these craft use these anti-gravity propulsion mechanisms to bend space-time around the craft, and that they are powered by reactors that use, at the time in the 80s and 90s, he claimed that it was element 115. Now, just to give a little bit of chemical background here, element 115 indicates that it is the 115th element on the periodic table, or an atom, an element that consists of atoms with 115 protons in their nucleus. We, at the time that he had claimed this, had no evidence that element 115 could exist in nature or could exist at all. We have since discovered element 115 and have created small amounts of it on the Earth. And when I say small, I mean small. I mean atoms worth. These larger nucleus elements are created in very tightly controlled lab settings. The way that we create them is to take 2 atoms of smaller size and use cyclotrons or particle accelerators to smash them together. And typically, because the nuclei of atoms are held together by the strong nuclear force, this force that acts over extremely small distances. We're talking between the proximity of protons here. Very, very small. They have very little influence outside of that immediate radius. The bigger your nucleus becomes, the less stable it is, because the strong nuclear force starts to diminish over as you grow in size of your nucleus. This is a very rudimentary explanation. I am not, once again, a particle physicist, so I'm sorry if some of my details are incorrect, but this is generally how I believe it works. element 115, now known as moscovium, because it was first created in Moscow in Russia. Or maybe it wasn't created in Moscow, but it was named after Moscow. It survives. We have had it survive for milliseconds. It is unstable, and it pretty much instantly decays. Bob Lazar claims that there were the fuel sources of these anti-gravity drives in the craft that he studied were like something like 230 grams of this stuff. A pretty sizable chunk. We're talking probably hundreds of millions, billions of atoms worth in stable form. Now, it could be that there is some stable configuration of element 115. We have not discovered it. It is unlikely that it is the case, but there could be some way to stabilize it if we're going to just take him at his word and use benefit of the doubt here. He claims that the fuel source works by using a small particle accelerator or cyclotron to smash another proton into the nucleus of element 115, now known as moscovium, to create element 116, which is unstable. The element 116 that is momentarily created decays very rapidly, releasing an antiproton. Now, an antiproton is a piece of antimatter, which for those who don't know is matter that contains the polar opposite charge of what we know as matter. In the case of an antiproton, a proton is positively charged, so this proton that would be ejected is negatively charged. And another property of antimatter, and we know that antimatter exists because we have created it in lab settings. A property of antimatter is that if it encounters its exact counterpart, if, for example, an antiproton encounters a proton, they annihilate each other and produce 100% energy. They release massive amounts of energy, which Bob Lazar claims was being used to drive a thermoelectric generator, so something that we use on Earth, which is basically taking the energy that is given off from this event and using it to create heat, which is then converted into electricity, which in turn powers the rest of the craft and enables the massive amounts of power required for these so-called anti-gravity generators to function. He has, like I said, his explanation of things is very elaborate. However, I, in my research, have found that he improperly uses a lot of terms related to physics. His understanding of gravity seems to be somewhat inaccurate. He makes a lot of claims that physicists have come forth and debunked pretty much fully. Everything from element 115 being unable to exist in a stable form to the way that he claims these anti-gravity drives work. For example, in creating a gravitational rift, bending space-time to the point where you could move through space-time at large distances instantaneously. When you bend that space-time, it bends everything within proximity. So the reason that the Earth has a gravitational pull is that its mass bends space-time around it. So everything around the Earth is pulled inwards towards the Earth because of this bending of space-time. If a craft was able to bend space-time to the extremity that Bob Lazar claims, anytime an anti-gravity drive would be used on Earth, the theory is that it would pull everything around it with it and would create a massive, obvious disturbance in our reality. That's one point that, scientists use to claim that Bob Lazar is not accurate here. He claims that because of the gravitational bending of these crafts, it obscures their visual appearance. So if a anti-gravity drive is activated on one of these crafts, if you looked straight up at it, it would seem invisible because gravity also bends light. It's a very interesting claim. He speaks, when you listen to Bob Lazar speak about this, he sounds very sincere. But ultimately, I have a lot more doubt than I have belief when I read his claims. It seems like the physics doesn't align. Element 115 has been created, and it seems does not exist in a stable form, as Bob Lazar claims. And there's really just been no verifiable evidence of any of this. It seems like he potentially did work at one of these bases, but there's been nobody coming forward to corroborate his stories. There's a lot of holes. I just get the feeling that he is making this up. I also saw one interesting tidbit about him, which gives you a little bit of a glimpse into his character, I think. He was also in the newspaper when he was a teenager because he had attached an engine to his bicycle and claimed to achieve speeds that, upon professional analysis, are not possible. They took the working potential of the engine that he used and calculated his mass, the mass of the bike, the mass of the engine, and determined that the engine actually would not have been able to physically give thrust enough to support his claim of speed. And that was when he was very young. And I'm not saying that that's a total write-off, but it is another instance where it seems that he's making an over-exaggerated or dubious claim for the sake of exposure and attention. So
you think he's a grifter?
I get that feeling.
My thought was like, is there a chance that he's somehow deluded or just like grossly mistaken on things that he has seen in some way, or is he just deliberately swindling people?
I mean, it's very possible. It's really hard to say, right? In this case, obviously, as I mentioned before, the government has huge interest. If they have this technology, they have a huge interest in keeping it secret. Obviously, if any government around the world would be able to unlock some of the technology that he's claiming is a part of these craft, they would instantly be the most powerful nation in the world and would be able to bend society to their whim. So it's hard to say. I think if the claims he's making are true, it is very likely that, like you said, he is probably misunderstanding the science here, because some of what he talks about in terms of physics is, like I said, been debunked. But you have to wonder, because if there's any legitimacy to these claims, the government would definitely do what they could to make him appear a liar, a grifter, to discredit him in any way possible. Just as an aside, and I don't know if this is necessarily relevant, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. Bob Lazar was arrested for being involved in a prostitution ring, and it's alleged that he had been using cameras in the rooms of the prostitutes and taking that footage in order to blackmail people. I don't know what that.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's
I haven't looked
interesting.
too deeply into it, but as far as I know, he was convicted. So it seems like there is some legitimacy to this on some level. Um, and obviously that doesn't really hold much sway in terms of his truthfulness regarding his claims about his work on these craft. But it's just an interesting tidbit to keep in mind about his potential character, the fact that he might be willing to uh, tread the line a little bit when it comes to morality or whatever. It's an interesting point. I wouldn't use it to really discredit him fully. It's just something to keep in mind.
Well,
Yeah,
if he's willing to exploit vulnerable people for money, that does seem to speak volumes to his character when you zoom out more
right.
into this situation. So I'm sorry, can we go back for a second? So were we able to confirm his employment in any sort of research facility? I know that his claims of like college education are dubious and potentially completely unfounded, unknown, I guess, uncertain is what we can say officially. But have we confirmed that, like, yes, he was employed directly or was contracted by the government anyway to work at any sort of facility? Do we have confirmation of that?
Um,
I'm
I
pretty sure
am
that
not.
has been confirmed. I've seen that over the years,
Now,
and in my research recently, that is like I think one part of his story that is kind of confirmed.
so that's
Right.
interesting to me because the government would, I would imagine. I mean, and again, it's worth diving into if we can confirm that, like what his roles were. But I think it's worth noting that the government would be a very how should we say, like a stringent judge of qualifications, right? Right. So it's like you go ahead, go ahead.
Well, the thing here too is if he was working on these crafts, I would imagine he would be required to get some type of security clearance, right?
Hmm.
And if he did indeed have a security clearance and then he goes and spills all the secrets, there seems like there would be a pretty clear legal way to kind of silence him, right? So why the
Hmm.
government hasn't ever done that definitely makes me question the validity of his claims a bit.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
Well, I'm just saying that if we have confirmed that he's been employed by the government in some I don't know, is it engineering capacity? If we've confirmed that, um, that should speak to some level that like he has to have been. Well, I suppose not has to have been, but high likelihood of a formal higher education, right? So it's curious that we can't confirm that, and yet we can confirm that he was employed to some degree by the government. Where, and again, to reiterate, I would imagine that the government would more than likely not hire someone without any credentials. I don't know. It just seems it's an interesting tidbit, right? Like, so it makes me think like, well, maybe he does have some credentials that have just been snuffed out. I don't know.
Well, I think the main claim for his credentials, so to go a little more in depth on the story, you know, Brandon had mentioned that he built this rocket car. So
That's true. That's
he was
true.
he was one time, so it was in the paper, and he was, I forget where he was. I think he actually went down to a lecture where there was a famous, I don't know, want to say physicist or something in town, and he wanted to go down and hear him speak. And when he went down, to go view the lecture, the guy who was giving the lecture was standing outside beforehand and was reading the newspaper. And it was the paper that Bob Lazar was featured in for his rocket car. So Bob says to him, "Hey, I'm the guy you're reading about." and they get to chatting a little bit and whatever. And he went and watched the lecture, and that was kind of the end of it. But years later, when Bob Lazar was looking to further employment, he actually sent a letter to this guy and said, "Hey, I'm the guy that talked to you outside that lecture. I'm the guy with the rocket car." And supposedly, this guy reached back out to Bob Lazar and offered him a job. So that would kind of explain the lack of credentials if there was kind of this, in-person thing happened and, he was kind of vetted there on the spot. I think
Okay.
that's kind of how he works around that, or how he wants that to be interpreted.
Mm-hmm. Although
Yeah,
he does insist that he has degrees, though. He insists that he does.
Yes.
Right? That's a sticking point. Like, he's very adamant about that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense of the guy's character, because at the end of the day, this is all hearsay, right? At the end of the day, this is all hearsay. So, trying to just kind of like microscope in, zero in on this guy's character, his motivations. Is there would there be a monetary motivation to making lies like this? I mean, he's published books, right? Has he not?
Yeah,
Or,
I mean, I
has.
imagine that he has made quite a bit of money. There is a huge following.
speaking tours.
He has published books. Yep, he's done a lot of signing events. I'm sure he's sold a lot of, uh, merch and things like that. Probably, I'm not sure,
I've bought
but
the merch.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
but
right. You, Alex, you have
I
a
have.
signed. Yeah, that's right.
yeah,
That's right. Well, there you go. That
Yeah.
says something there, right?
Yeah.
it's definitely a potential motivation for something like this. But I think, from seeing that article about him making those dubious claims about the engine on his bike, I'm curious if maybe he just likes the attention and the spotlight, you know. Um, just to go back real
Yeah, I
quick,
mean,
in reading some stuff I just pulled up, there is a verified entry of Bob Lazar's name in a phone book from his time working at Los Alamos. This doesn't necessarily disprove or prove his claims, but it does seem to indicate that he was living in that area.
so it's
Which,
circumstantial.
right, it is circumstantial. Also, in what I'm reading here, there was a spotlight by KLAS TV, in which George Knapp, who is a journalist who investigates a lot of these kinds of things, says that he had called Los Alamos multiple times. They said that they had no records of him ever working there, and that is as far that's all they got. So it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into it more, and we'd have to get some more evidence, but I'm not even there's just no way to verify it. And like you said, I think a lot of this comes down to his claims and hearsay, with there being no evidence.
I think the interesting thing here is when you listen to Bob Lazar speak, he definitely doesn't come across crazy. And much like we talked about, I think, in one of our last episodes about the Mandela effect, I can't remember the woman's name, but she did the same thing as Bob Lazar, where they used kind of scientific language to describe something that nobody really has proof of. So just listening to him, it's very easy to see why people get convinced that this story is true. There's not many people out there that I've found, at least in my years of looking at this kind of stuff, that really approach it from, if you want to call it, a scientific perspective. You get a lot of accounts where it's like, oh, well, I saw a UFO, fly over this field. But this guy's actually saying, I helped reverse engineer it. And it's like, it's a very kind of interesting perspective that just gets a lot of ears. And, if we're
Right.
talking about the monetary kind of aspect of it, as a motivation, I mean, it did land him on Joe Rogan, the biggest podcast in the world. I mean, so obviously, if he's out for attention, it's working.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's very curious. I'm not sure where like I said, I have the gut feeling that he's probably not being truthful, but it's really hard to say without some solid proof or, you know, corroborative statements. Um, but I will say in recent times, there have been some events which may seem to give a little bit more credence to what he's saying, which I think is a good segue into our next and probably most interesting topic. Alex, if you want to take this away.
Sure. Within the last few years, a lot of our listeners probably have heard of the Tic Tac video. So I'm going to go over a little bit about where that came from and specifically about a commander in the Air Force named David Fravor. So in November of 2004, Fravor was commanding a squadron of fighter jets, and he was doing a training exercise near the USS Nimitz ship. This was off the coast of San Diego. So while he was out there doing his training, he got a call over the radio saying that there was going to be a real world engagement. So what that means is that this has now turned into a mission, that the training has stopped and we are going to actually do something. So he was told a location. I guess they were tracking this thing on the radar of the Nimitz. And as they were tracking it, they instructed Fravor and another pilot to go check out something that they had seen, as a blip on the radar. So just to kind of keep the story tidy, there are 4 people involved in this. There's Fravor. He was the pilot of one of the jets. There's his, I don't want to say it wrong. So, there's somebody behind him in the plane, and then there's another plane with a female pilot and somebody behind her. So there's 4 people in total. So as they went out towards this object, they got another call over the radio as they were approaching it saying merge plot, which means that they are now in the same resolution space on the radar as the object. So when they approached the object, they actually saw something that looked, as he described, like a Tic Tac. Now, it wasn't small like a Tic Tac. This was a rather large ship, or whatever you want to call it, object. And on the radar, this object had been seen going from 80,000 feet down to about 20,000 feet, then back up to 80,000 feet, and it seemed to kind of go between these 2 different heights. So when they actually approached the object, what Fravor claims is that he saw it moving left and right, back and forth rapidly, kind of like a ping pong ball. Now, he seems everything that he says about his background seems very credible. Nobody's ever questioned him on that. It all seems very credible. He was, one of the Top Gun pilots. That's all been proven. He's spoken before Congress. He seems to be credible as far as that goes. But so when he saw this object bouncing back and forth, below him, he decided to approach it and get a better look at it. So as he starts to descend to get a better look, he notices that on the water, he can see like kind of white caps underneath of it, but he doesn't see any rotor wash like a normal helicopter would have. So this object was, by the time he was approaching it, stationary, and there was some things that were strange about it. I guess the big one was that as soon as he started to approach, it almost seemed like the object kind of realized that he was in its vicinity, and it just vanished. So this had been a phenomenon that they had been seeing kind of over and over again on their radar systems, and nobody had really gotten a good look at it yet. But so there are multiple people who saw this. And then I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, one of you guys, I think within a week or 2, they were actually able to record footage of the craft. Now, the footage didn't come actually from David Fravor's aircraft, but it came from somebody else's aircraft who had a similar experience. Now, these aircraft have on them a FLIR camera, which stands for a forward-looking IR camera, so think a thermal camera. So it's able to pick up on heat signatures. So they were actually able to track this object with the FLIR camera and get video of it. And this video ended up being known as the Tic Tac video because that's what David Fravor referred to it as looking like. And this is a video that got spread throughout all the different news sources. You can find it on YouTube very easily. But it's one of the only times that we have kind of a government, somebody in the government saying the backstory, and then we actually have video of it happening.
If I'm not mistaken, didn't he claim that this object was actively radar jamming?
Yes, he did. And that was one of the things.
Yeah.
So the government's very careful not to release a lot of information about their radar systems. If you look at the video, there's sometimes on the video there'll be like blurred out text on the on-screen display from the camera. They're very careful to not give all that information away. So that hasn't really made it to the mainstream, like kind of take on it very often, but that is what he claimed, that it was able to jam their radar.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting.
Yeah,
it's definitely an interesting capability to have.
Yeah, and another interesting thing from my research on this that he pointed out is that normally with a thermal camera, so like you said, it's detecting heat signatures, right? So if you're going to be recording let's say a jet or an airplane with a thermal camera, you would see the exhaust.
Right.
You would literally see a cloud, something amounting to a cloud on the thermal camera. Whereas, and I'm playing the footage right now on my stream as we're having this discussion, there is nothing of the sort. There is no visible heat signature of exhaust being emitted from this object at all. It's suspended in space, and then it zooms away extremely rapidly. Also, the speed in which if you didn't know better, you wouldn't necessarily know how fast it was going. But based on the research I was doing, according to this video, when it goes out of sight of the thermal camera, the speed is, according to him, absurdly rapid, like flicking your finger rapid.
Right, like orders of magnitude faster than anything that we have, any type of technology that we've ever demonstrated publicly.
Right. He was comparing like what I think he was saying like the F-22 is arguably like the best jet that we have in existence right now. At least it's a contender for fastest. And he was saying that like it would display, if we were taking the same field of view here with this thermal camera and tracking an F-22, it would be substantially by several magnitudes slower, right? Like this just goes off in a second. Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
And the really interesting thing about that is the force that kind of acceleration would cause on both the craft and its occupants, if there were any occupants, would be way more than the technology that we have and our bodies could stand.
Like the G-force or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. And also, because of what we know about physics, to generate that kind of shift in inertia would require extremely large amounts of energy. And the fact that it's, the engines that we use to propel craft, are typically combustion engines, where a substance is combusted in order to generate thrust, and therefore that's why you get the heat, because the energy put off by the combustion reaction in the engines causes heat. As the energy that it expels is given off also as heat. So the fact that there is no visible infrared trace of an increase in heat from the propulsion of this is really bizarre. It would mean that whatever the craft was using to propel itself would be giving off a massive amount of energy, and would also give off no thermal signature, which we have no capability of in our current science.
That we know of.
So I just want to say, so in the video, if any of our listeners are checking it out, just so you understand, with that FLIR camera system in particular, the darker something is, the more heat it's putting off. So the object is putting off heat, but not in the way that we would normally think, as Brandon described, like in a normal propulsion system. It seems like the whole craft is, emitting some type of heat, but not in any, propulsion way.
Thanks for
Also,
clarifying that.
it's interesting that gets inverted halfway through the video. I don't know if I don't know what is changing in that. But the first half of the video, the object is, like you say, black, which is indicating heat, and the background is like a light gray, white. But halfway through the video, that gets inverted. I don't know what other. I think the pilot or whoever was controlling the camera was putting on different settings to try to get a sense of what it was.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Yeah.
And you also have in the video this craft making rotations that seem abnormal based on the way that we propel craft. It rotates in place at times, and it's just a very strange way to move. And we know of nothing like that in modern technology that can move that way or uses that sort of movement. So it's very, very strange.
It is. It is. I mean, so Occam's razor, boys. What are we thinking? What's the most likely explanation for this?
Well, my gut says that it is likely technology that we just are not aware of on a societal level.
Mm-hmm.
Something that has, some dark technology that is being worked on behind the scenes, such as secret research facilities like Area 51 in Los Alamos. It could, I mean, honestly, that's the only thing I could think other than it is, in fact, an extraterrestrial civilization's craft.
Yeah, right.
I think it's probably those two. I can't think
Yeah,
of any other.
because you can pretty quickly rule out like the whole like fluke or error, like you're getting
Mhm.
some sort of false signal because uh, they all claim to have seen this with their own eyes, and it was from two different perspectives too. Two
Mhm.
separate planes, both saw it, and they have it recorded here on these thermal cameras. So I think having recordings of it and eyewitness accounts, having those things corroborate, you can rule out any sort of like technological glitch or error.
Mhm.
Because that would have been one of the easiest things to put out there, is that or explanations I meant to say, is that it was
Right.
some sort of error. But no, I think we can quickly rule that out. Um, I am inclined to think that it's some highly classified technology that we have created, someone has created, and then it's incredibly compartmentalized, which would probably explain why uh they're not aware of what it is, even though they're in the military. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the biggest point here that would not make me believe that it is something from our country or our military is that the government put this out. Surely if or I should say allowed it to reach the public. If this was something that was a US military classified piece of technology, I see no reality in which the government would allow this to reach the public in this way, because the narrative is that they don't know, and it seems like if you knew that this was something that's a part of your military complex or something that is your top secret technology, even if it reaches the public, you would use every possible tactic to try and discredit this. It would be super easy to say, oh, well, our camera was malfunctioning, or it's not what it seems, or a million other things that would allow you to give enough reasonable doubt for people to write it off. But the fact that that has not occurred makes me believe that it is likely not a part of the US intelligence operation or military.
Is there a chance? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex. You first.
I also wonder if, and maybe this is kind of like, a bit of a mental leap, but could this be some type of propaganda by the government? We saw a lot of interesting things during the Cold War. Could this be a way of us kind of showing without telling other militaries around the world, like, hey, look what we can do, without coming out and saying, we can do it.
That's
Right.
what I was going to say. Like, is there a possibility that this is some form of a limited hangout? I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
A limited hangout.
No, could you explain that for me, please?
Yes, I would be happy to. So I'll just read it right from Wikipedia. A limited hangout is, quote, spy jargon for a favored and frequently used gimmick of the clandestine professionals. When their veil of secrecy is shredded and they can no longer rely on a phony cover story to misinform the public, they resort to admitting, sometimes even volunteering, some of the truth while still managing to withhold the key and damaging facts in the case. The public, however, is usually so intrigued by the new information that it never thinks to pursue the matter further. I don't know. Potentially, they put it out there. Like, there's the footage. They let everyone think maybe this is extraterrestrials, when in fact, the reality is that they have some new technology that the public isn't privy to. That they can no longer fully. Yeah. You see
So
where I'm
maybe
going.
these pilots caught wind of this and got this footage without being in the know about what was going on
Mm-hmm.
from our own government, and that would make sense. I could see
Yeah,
that.
So the powers that be are like, let them go out and have this discussion, let the public speculate wildly about it being of extraterrestrial origin, good enough. And if foreign nations who are wise to this, like, see it for what it really is, i.e. our technology, all the better. They can see that we have some real shit that they best not fuck with us.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I don't know. That was one of the things that came to my mind, is it's a possibility that it's a limited hangout of sorts.
Right.
But it's still, as far as what evidence do we have of something being truly extraterrestrial? It's a compelling argument. This piece of evidence here
Mm-hmm.
is, to me, maybe the most compelling that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you guys also research, what was his name? Ryan Graves, I believe?
Yeah. I
was
looked
the
into him a bit too.
he was the other pilot who testified in the Grush hearings, correct? Or am I wrong? Okay.
Correct. Yes, and he's been, in the media circuit. He's been on Rogan. He's been on Lex Friedman's podcast, and he had a similar but slightly different story. So he does a lot of training in Virginia Beach, and for anybody who's ever been there before, they're constantly flying jets overhead. So there's a lot of, there's constant jet activity there. So you would think, there's a lot of eyes in the sky. Now, what Graves claims is that during training maneuvers and training, practice, once again, they were getting weird blips on their radar. And so this happened at the same time as they were transitioning from an analog to a digital style radar. So at first they just chalked it up to kind of, oh, maybe it's a glitch in the system, it's just, something like that. But pilots, and I think he actually claimed to have seen it as well, actually caught a glimpse with their own eyes of an object there. And the way they described this object is kind of eerie. They described a black cube that was contained within a clear sphere. And it would be directly around where their entry point, as they call it, is for their training. So when they would fly up there and start, a maneuver, it would be right there at the beginning. And he remembers, Graves said he remembered talking to other pilots that he worked with, and they were worried about it because they had almost hit it multiple times, and they were worried about their safety.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, these are prominent examples of what we now blanket refer to as UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. But these are not the only times that pilots have claimed these things, and it's been going on for a long time and is not exclusive to the US. So it seems like there are definitely things out there that we cannot explain and that have been witnessed by people, many people. So it really makes you wonder what is going on. And Alex, did you dive into the Grush hearings at all? Do we want to go over that at all? Because I think that is just another level of escalation of this, and was partially taken seriously because of the fact that pilots were getting concerned that these things were a risk and that not enough information was being put out and that pilots were not being trained to deal with these things. Commercial pilots, too.
Yeah, I didn't look into it specifically. I remember when the Grush story broke, I had looked into it, but I know that David Fravor and Graves had both testified during that congressional hearing, the kind of now famous congressional hearing. But if you wanted to talk about that, I'm more than interested if that was something that you had kind of dived into.
I mean, I hadn't done any recent research really. I know that things are still happening. I kind of intermittently check in on it and try and keep up to date on whether there's going to be more hearings and what people are talking about. But for those who don't remember, the Grush hearings were it was a disclosure of this testimony by Fravor, Graves, and David Grush, who I don't remember his position. I believe he worked in intelligence. He was an intelligence officer.
I believe
He's
so.
an Air Force officer. Grush was a United States Air Force officer
Air
and
Force
former
officer.
intelligence officer. He was both.
Gotcha. So he's another person with a lot of credentials. And he spoke out about these things enough to the point where it was taken seriously by the public and the government to the point where they testified in front of a congressional committee, a bipartisan congressional committee, meaning multiple people on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, were in attendance, and the Congress people that were questioning these folks and hearing this testimony were deadly serious about it, and a lot of people were very vocally pushing for disclosure from the government of other instances where unidentified aerial phenomenon or unexplained things like this should be disclosed to the public. For one of the main arguments I remember was that, like I mentioned, for the safety of commercial and private pilots, so that they would be aware that these things are happening and would be able to anticipate and deal with situations like this if they were to arise. And I think it's just really a big deal because it shows that, at least from a public facing government presentation, they seem to be taking this matter seriously, and a lot of people are calling for the government to disclose some of this. So it it makes me wonder about Bob Lazar and his claims. Maybe it is the case that the government does indeed have reclaimed extraterrestrial technology that they are working on, and maybe this is some of the fruits of that research, or maybe it is in fact some sort of real extraterrestrial phenomenon occurring. You know, I it's really hard to work your brain around this. You know, it really I was enthralled by this hearing and the fact that serious people were taking it seriously. It really makes you wonder.
I mean, the fact that he's giving this testimony under oath,
Mm-hmm.
that's not trivial.
Right, right. He has a lot at stake. Everybody who testified at that hearing has a lot at stake, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they all seem to be really well vetted in terms of their character, in terms of their tenure in their positions. And these are not the type of people like you can write off. Like Bob Lazar, it's pretty easy to write him off. There's a lot of like murkiness around his story and everything. These people, not so much. You really, if you listen to them, you really feel like they're being honest about these things.
You know,
And yeah,
oh, sorry. Yeah, it just had me think. I wish I had researched this ahead of time, but I was. You had me thinking. Has there been much or any collaboration between Lazar and Grudge? I wonder.
I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know, but I do know that a lot of people have begun to re-examine Bob Lazar's claims in light of the Grush hearings and the government kind of putting some of this out, saying, "Yeah, it's legit." But I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the interaction between those two. I would assume so, but I don't
Yeah.
know. There might be some evidence out there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just did a quick Google search of both of their names together, and nothing directly popped up.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, correct me, gentlemen, if I am wrong, but I swear I remember during the hearings, and this is an interesting point to take note of. I believe he described the crafts that are in discussion here that he's whistleblowing as extra dimensional. Didn't he say that? He didn't just say that they were extraterrestrial. He said they were extra dimensional.
He did.
That was the interesting thing about the Grush hearing, was that was kind of a news spin on things that we hadn't really heard anybody say. But yes, he claimed that they were extra dimensional, and I'm not quite sure all what he said about it, but it was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, he seemed really uh compelling that he really believed this. And it almost implied that there was some sort of evidence from when he was working in intelligence that would lead him to believe this. He even mentioned at one point that he possessed knowledge that there were deaths related to this. He didn't specify or couldn't specify exactly the circumstances around that. It makes you wonder whether, if this is true, uh, that in researching this, the technology somehow would have led to someone's death, or if there were deaths because of assassinations uh, on the government's behalf of people who wanted to also blow the whistle.
Hmm.
Not sure, but
Well, I
it's
mean, the government has killed people for a hell of a lot less.
it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I just don't know what to make of it. I'm deeply curious to hear more, and I hope that we this leads to more disclosure about this stuff. Uh,
yeah. I
whether or not it's extraterrestrial or just top secret technology, I just want to know.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
not to
Alex.
be too much of a bummer, but have you guys been kind of keeping track of what's been happening with like UAP disclosure in the recent weeks?
I heard there was going to be another hearing in November. Is that
Okay.
correct?
I believe so. The other thing
Mm.
that I had heard was there was some bill that was coming across the floor. I don't think the bill had anything specifically to do with UAP disclosure, but you know how they always kind of pack other things into a bill, in hopes that they pass alongside the bill. There was something in there called, I believe, the UAP Disclosure Act. And for some reason that was taken out or completely changed. So that was one thing people, who are interested in this topic were really looking forward to passing. But I think that portion is no longer, going through. So I don't
Right.
know what that
Huh.
means for the larger picture, but it's kind of a bummer if you're into this,
Right.
Yeah.
I think that it it almost gives more credence to the theory that this is some sort of top secret technology that our government has. It would obviously be in their interest to try and make it as difficult as possible or prevent any sort of disclosure bill from coming through, because it would surely lead to uh, not only the public but other nations, other governments getting a glimpse into what we're doing if it is related to our government's research.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in terms of it being something more, something extraterrestrial, extra dimensional, it's hard to say because I don't know if it's compelling enough proof. I think that the Occam's razor here is that it's more likely that it is something that someone on Earth has created that is just far above
Well,
technologically anything that we have.
uh, another key point to note here is maybe I'm incorrect. I'm scanning the internet right now to make sure I have this right, but I'm pretty sure he claims, David Grush, that is, did he not claim that they recovered bodies?
I believe
Like,
He
he
did.
did.
He did,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, and bodies is in like something not human,
And
not
multiple.
non-human corpse entities that were inside these alleged crafts that were uh collected by the government. Which, by the way, as a quick aside, since we've gone this far down, I think we should definitely like return to this
Mhm.
particular facet of the discussion in another episode. But
Mhm.
since we're already here, as just like a quick note that I find so interesting because it just sounds like the topic of the it sounds like the concept of a sci-fi novel. But Grush claims to have viewed documents reporting a spacecraft of non-human origin had been recovered by Benito Mussolini's government in 1933 and procured by the United States in either 1944 or 45 with the assistance of the Vatican. Which is so.
So,
I mean, he's saying this under oath. It's so.
yeah.
It literally sounds like a great setting for a wild sci-fi show or book. But this is what the man is literally saying happened. Claims that there were corpses inside. He claims that people have been killed trying to release this information, as we stated earlier. Um, boy, is it I had to throw it in there. It's so strange.
Yeah, the whole thing is just so weird, and you've gotta wonder, would these people go to this length if it was some sort of, like, hoax or a grasp for attention or something? I mean, it's just I don't know. I just don't know what to make of it.
Well, again, I mean, playing with the limited hangout idea, like this could be some elaborate controlled opposition thing the government's doing to perhaps this David Grush guy and perhaps Bob Lazar, perhaps they're both agents of the government that are deliberately doing this as actors to kind of steer the public perception away from the idea that this is technology we have and to make it seem like some fanciful extraterrestrial thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I could see
Yeah.
it. I could see it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see as time goes on. I mean, one of the things that's so cool about this is that it's a presently evolving situation.
Right.
So,
And I think inevitably over time, even if it's not in our lifetime, right, we will eventually see whether it's through communication with another civilization or the use of this technology in some war context or something. I imagine that the truth will come out at some point, inevitably, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you would think.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, in terms of pinning this to extraterrestrials or alien civilizations, I just don't know. I don't think there's enough tangible evidence to convince me that that's the case. But I really can't say for certain. This is just my rational mind trying to be as rational as possible. And it's really hard to when you're talking about these types of things. I just don't know. Just don't know. I think it's the
Yeah.
most compelling um thing that we've talked about on this episode so far that would lead me to most like it would be the most likely evidence that there has been extraterrestrial beings or extra dimensional beings that have been in contact with the earth or have visited the earth.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think?
I mean, I would agree. That's the I mean, my pea brain tries to keep a level of skepticism in all these things, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I don't outright believe it because of that. But like you said, of everything that we've discussed so far in tonight's episode, uh, and just everything regarding this whole phenomenon in general, some of these things that have been coming out in the past couple years seem to be the most compelling that we've ever had, ever in the whole history of UAPs, UFOs. Uh, yeah, it's certainly eyebrow raising.
Right. So, do we think do you guys think that we have been visited by extraterrestrial beings?
Hmm.
Oh, it's such a hard question. I'm just
It
I'm gonna
really
rip the
is.
Band-Aid off. My gut says that we have. I've always thought that we had. I don't really have a good reason for believing that. But I don't know. This definitely starts to like add some credence to the idea.
Mhm.
Um, there's definitely something going on. Think it's safe to say there's definitely something going on that we're not being told, whether that's aliens or, you know, some crazy government technology. Something is going on. I don't think it's a natural phenomenon. I don't think it's an optical illusion. I think that these are real things that are happening, but it's so hard to pin it down and attribute it specifically to aliens. But you do hear these people in the government, you know, specifically Grush saying this, and it's like the guy's pretty vetted, you know.
Mhm.
If he was talking about any other topic, I would tend to believe the man,
Mhm.
right? Um so why is it different when he starts talking about aliens? I guess just because of how extraordinary the claim is and
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
how destabilizing and strange it would be to finally know that yeah, they're here or they've been here or they've influenced us in some way, shape, or form. Um, but I don't know. My gut tells me that yeah, there's probably they're probably aware of us at the least.
Mhm.
But I don't, like I said, I don't really have a good reason other
Mhm.
than kind of just a gut feeling for that.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I mean, you know, when you think about Fermi's paradox, if based on the size of the universe, the sheer number of star systems out there, the sheer likelihood there is that there is another planet that would be suitable for life. And you start to do the calculations, and it is almost it's way more improbable that there is no other life than it is that there is, right? And the fact that we seem to not have had any real evidence for it is very strange. It's led to a lot of theories about why that may be. Chops, do you have something to say?
Well, the question of whether extraterrestrial life exists and the question of whether extraterrestrial life has been in contact with us eh, are obviously two very different things, right? So
Right.
like on the question on just the question of do I think extraterrestrial life exists? If I was going to bet money, I'd say yeah.
Hmm.
Given everything you just said, it seems almost absurd to conclude that, as unlikely as it is that we're here, that we're the only instance that this has happened.
Right.
Yes, the conditions for life on this planet to come about, so many things needed to align perfectly, right? Because we have
Hmm.
such a beautifully, bewilderingly complex planet and solar system that all these huge systems aligned in such a way that we're able to exist. Seems
Hmm.
unlikely that it should have ever happened at all, but it did. And if it could happen once, given the ridiculously incomprehensible scale and scope of the universe, I, the numbers, the numbers would indicate that it's happened probably several times,
Right.
right?
And
But
it's also
yeah.
likely that if it is in fact the truth that there are other intelligent beings out there, that based on the time scale of the universe, it is also likely that there are certain civilizations which have been around for eons longer than us. And you think about Moore's law, the way that technology increasingly develops at an exponential rate. If you have a civilization, even if it's been around for a couple thousand years longer than us, you've got to imagine, like, think about where we were, when we just a hundred years ago, and where we are now.
Hmm.
It is very plausible that they have uncovered the laws of the universe to the point where this kind of sci-fi-esque technology has been discovered. And my point earlier in talking about the Fermi paradox is, maybe there is no Fermi paradox. Maybe this is the evidence. Maybe they are out there, and maybe we just, either through the fact that it's such a hard concept to get our minds around, or the fact that there's been deliberate attempts to prevent us from being aware of these things. We just haven't It seems like we haven't been visited or contacted or shown any real evidence, but that may in fact not be the case if what these people are saying is true, you know?
Hmm. It feels like, yeah, as the years go on, it feels like we're getting tantalizingly closer and closer with all of these hearings and all of these like videos and all of these witness statements.
Mhm.
May- maybe, maybe, maybe we have been visited. Maybe the governments of the world want to control the output of the narrative as much as possible.
Mhm.
So maybe they're building us up to a grand moment within the next decade where they finally reveal it.
Well, I was gonna bring up, if there is in fact real evidence of this, if there are people on the earth who have confirmed and are in the know that we have in fact seen other extraterrestrial civilizations, why do you think that it has been hidden from us?
It's a
Well,
great question.
the way I've always thought about it is like, what would that do to society? and we can speculate. Obviously that might be fun, but so if aliens came here, we had proof of that. Say, they came. Well, I'm throwing out a date, like in the 40s or something, and like we weren't sure at the time if we should tell society, tell the people or not. After you cover it up for long enough, it becomes a double-edged sword, where it's like, at the time, by the time you're ready to kind of come out with it, if you do, people are going to look down on the government so much for covering that up. Probably, aliens being here would be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, happening or discovery of all humanity, right? I think it's pretty safe to say. So, like, by the time you cover it up so long, it's difficult to then kind of, reveal it to people without sowing some serious distrust in the government. So that's one reason I think that it could potentially be covered up. The other is, if we look at humans as kind of creatures that tend to have a lot of wars, right? So there's a big benefit to us keeping that technology for ourselves, and hopefully, as Bob Lazar claims to have done, reverse engineer it and use it for our military and for war. So I could see us wanting to kind of keep it quiet for that reason, so we could have the upper hand.
Yeah, and I agree with you in all those points. I personally think the biggest reason is the fact that those in power realize the destabilizing effect that this revelation would have. I think, if you think let's follow the thought experiment that what Grush is saying is true, and that there have been craft recovered as early as the 30s and 40s. Especially in that time, you had large swaths of the population that, rely on their religious beliefs as a facet of stability in how they live their lives. They go about, they participate in society, they have this thing that motivates them, and this really destabilizes a person's ability to believe in a lot of these things, religious and otherwise, and you really have to start to question everything if this comes out as true. You think about times when people claim that there have been miracles or unexplained things that don't agree with the laws of physics as we know them. Everything starts to deteriorate a little bit in terms of its ability to be believed without any questioning. And I think that those in power see that this revelation would have such a large impact on how society functions. It, like, there would be riots, there would be people who are revolting against these claims. There would be people who start to apply some sort of religious meaning to these civilizations. I think it starts to really erode the stability that we have established as a human society. People would, act in all sorts of ways. They would, the authority of governments on Earth would be questioned. I think, what you said is true too, that it, the fact that they have hidden it from us also, it coming out would really erode the trust in the government. And, I think those are the biggest reasons why.
Yeah, and maybe that's, if we go along with that idea, maybe that's the reason why the evidence, it feels like the evidence is building slowly, tantalizingly. Maybe a long drawn out, decades long revelation is, maybe, if we assume that this is the case, maybe they've calculated that that's the safest way to let it out, would be to let people grapple with the idea and get comfortable with it over the course of years.
And
Right. It makes
you're
you wonder
definitely
if, yeah.
You're definitely
Go
not
ahead.
the only one thinking that, Chops, because you see a lot of people talk about like soft disclosure online when they talk about this topic. And what
Mhm.
soft disclosure is, it's not coming out and just saying the thing. It's slowly, letting people know like, hey, this is weird, and then you eventually, it gets to the point where the thing, in this case UFOs or UAPs, it's, all of a sudden you just realize like, oh yeah, that they were real all along. It just
Mhm.
they slowly ease you into it, kind of like getting in a pool. You get in slowly, so you get kind of acclimated to the temperature of the water. By the time you're
Mhm.
in, you didn't feel bad at all. So I think
Right.
it's a common thought that people have when they approach this topic.
Right.
On the
Maybe one day we'll find that the government has been funding all of these alien movies as propaganda. Maybe, Will Smith has been in on it the whole time, and Independence Day is just a brilliant piece of propaganda.
What's it? Predictive programming?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Is that
there
is
you
that,
go.
is that not the term?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But on the flip side to this, though, when we talk about the revelation of this being destabilizing, I question how destabilizing would it actually be? Would there be riots? Probably initially. Would there be social unrest? Broadly speaking, probably. But I mean, would this ruin humanity? I mean, people still want to eat, right? So people just not going to work anymore? Are people just
I
like, oh, aliens exist? That equals no longer taking any human affairs seriously.
I don't
Do
think
you know
it's
what I
so
mean?
much that. I think it's more the fact that uh the let me think on this. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good. You get my point, though, right?
Yeah,
Like,
totally. And I agree. I don't think it would be like the death of civilization as we know it.
right, because like on the one hand, if the revelation comes out that aliens are real, I'm probably not going to go to work that day because, like, well, none of us should for at least a day. We got to grapple with this.
Right.
but
I think
but at a
yeah,
certain point, it's like, well, life has to keep going on, right? I mean,
right. I think it's more the effect in on like people's individual mental states on average. You have a lot of people who depend on this stable idea of reality as we know it, who rely on, concepts like God and things like that, that, would fall into panic, like it would lead people to feeling like this floor of stability had dropped out from under them on an individual level. And like I said, I don't think that I agree with you. I don't think it would cause the downfall of society, but I think it would have a huge effect, and it would decrease productivity in terms of work. It would, erode people's trust in government, and all these things are disadvantageous to those who have an interest in power.
And I think
mhm.
it gets even scarier if you kind of extrapolate what Grush is saying, and these are interdimensional beings. Like, think the aliens might be behind you right now. They might be in your house. They might be living among us. And it's like that take and his take on this seems like it would be a lot more destabilizing than, hey, look at this creature. It's similar to me. It's, flesh and blood. I get maybe not flesh and blood, but it's like a creature, where like interdimensional beings seems like much more destabilizing to think that they have influence upon us in which we can't see or know.
Right.
Right.
Would that kind of imply that they would could be lording over us completely? That we could be de facto, like,
Yeah.
unbeknownst to
And
us, that we're just slaves to
Yeah.
them?
yeah, it could, this is lends credence to the simulation theory idea. It could be very
Mm.
likely that what we're experiencing is the the people who set up the simulation, if you, want to go down that road.
Interesting. Well, that opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
Brandon talked about like how solid reality is. It's like once you start introducing new dimensions, it just completely throws any conventional thinking out the window very quickly.
Right. Everything is comes into question.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah. You can't even rely on math anymore, or like provable physics. It just doesn't matter,
Right. I mean, even to someone like me who I like to believe is pretty well grounded and like feels that even if something like this happened, I could deal with it. It's I was sitting there during the Grush hearings and hearing him talk about interdimensional beings, and I was almost starting to get anxiety about it all. Just feeling like everything I've built up in terms of how I view the world and the way I live my life is coming into question. And I could see how a lot of people who might not feel so secure in their understanding of the world or have some sort of rock solid idea of how things work and aren't open to the idea of things not working that way could be thrown into an absolute panic at this revelation.
Especially if we're unsure if they're good or evil. I mean,
Right.
if they're good, that's one thing, and how could we ever truly know? But if they're evil, we're screwed. We're really screwed. I mean, they could literally do anything,
Right.
according to us.
And we're even coming at this from our sense of morality. It could very well be that while they're not malicious, if we are a part of some dimensional experiment, or we're like a little farm, or we're a simulation or whatever, they could not even have some sort of like malevolent intentions, but we would perceive them as malevolent because it could have an effect on us being able to exist and live our lives. It's a scary
Mhm.
thought.
I mean, that's a similar thought to what people think of when they think of like the AI taking over, right?
Mhm.
We hope that it has what we perceive as our best interest in mind, but what it thinks is best isn't necessarily what we value as the best.
Right.
Yeah, it on an existential level, uh, it would also be destabilizing because it would all but guarantee, or not guarantee. Let me rephrase that. It would completely nullify the notion that a lot of people have that we're like the center of everything, that man
Mhm.
is like the most important thing in the universe. Um, that just completely goes out the window, and makes makes us seem like utterly insignificant.
Right.
And just on like on an existential level, that would probably just fill so many, like countless people with a level of anxiety that like you mentioned earlier, at that point it could potentially render a lot of religion moot.
Mhm.
It's interesting in the last few years, I believe, and you go look this up. The Pope made some kind of comments about acknowledging the existence of aliens and saying that still fits within our kind of biblical understanding of the world. So he's kind of trying to cover his ass.
Well, it's interesting, because we could talk about like how society would react to this for a long time, because there's so many, like countless ways, like so many different thoughts could bubble up out of this. Like there would be people that would outright deny it, claim that it's a lie.
Mhm.
There would be people that would try to incorporate it into their pre-existing religions, I am sure. Got to tell the aliens about Jesus, or potentially, or another way to work it out would be like maybe Jesus was one of them.
Hmm. Right.
Maybe the
Yeah,
spiritual supernatural happenings claimed by the religious books of the world were actually these beings.
they're right. That would be one way I would start to wonder about it if this came to reveal itself, is that, maybe these things that we've written off as quote unquote rational people could in fact actually have happened and are the result of these beings or whatever, which,
Wouldn't that
even
be such like almost is ironic the word a twist? Like
yeah.
like these ancient peoples weren't lying when they claimed to have witnessed miracles. We just
Right, right. We were the assholes the whole time.
Yeah.
Oh
I mean, I already knew I was an asshole, but not in
yeah,
that
yeah,
way.
exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So, like, let's try and like bring ourselves back to a little bit more of a stable conversation because I'm losing it. No, I'm just kidding. But why don't we go through? Why don't we think? Uh, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that there is an alien civilization. Let's just put them at Zeta Reticuli, as Bob Lazar claims the aliens from the craft that he was studying were from, which I think is some odd 100 light years away, 60 light years away. I don't recall. It's relatively close, universally speaking. Let's put a biological alien civilization on a planet around Zeta Reticuli. Let's say that they've had a few thousand years or even a million years ahead of us in terms of evolution and technology development. Let's imagine that the things that we have discussed are the direct result of their exploration of the universe and their interest in our society. Can we think through how they might think and why they might present themselves in the way that they have if we are to take these things at face value?
Yeah.
Mm.
So, I would think if I'm doing the thought experiment, I would think that they probably see life as a precious and rare thing. Obviously, not so rare that it doesn't happen, but rare enough that it's worth preserving, right? And it's
Mhm.
probably life everywhere, even on even on Earth and our ecosystems, is unique. There's unique forms of life everywhere, and it seems almost like a miracle that life exists at all. So it would be worth studying these things. What does this planet have? Just to see whether it's the beauty or the intelligence of the design itself. Because there feels like there would be something to be learned from almost everything. I mean, we often look at the animal kingdom and just on a rudimentary level when we're talking about this, like come up with new ways to cure diseases or ways to view our life, based on what we see other creatures doing. So I think that they would be interested in seeing how life evolved elsewhere. Potentially, like I said, for many different beneficial reasons to them, whether it's medical or scientific or whatever it would be. But I think that they would be interested in preserving life, as long as the life that they are thinking about preserving isn't something that is going to cause mass destruction of the universe itself.
Mhm.
Right. They obviously wouldn't, or not obviously, there's no obvious here, but I don't think that they would want to preserve a species that was going to be reckless and destroy things. But you could also take like the more kind of Star Trek approach, where alien civilizations have kind of a law. Imagine now we're going to jump even further. Maybe like imagine a galactic federation, right, where there's multiple alien species, talking amongst themselves. They, I don't think it's wild to say what Star Trek has said and say maybe they have a law where they are not supposed to interfere overtly with
Mm.
these other places for whatever reason. I think it's kind of part baked into their morality, right?
Mhm.
Like, hey, we don't mess with anybody for whatever reason. So I don't think that
Or
that's
they've seen evidence of what can happen before.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And then you can kind of pare down on
Mhm.
that and say, if the aliens came here and they only helped the United States, what would happen to the world then, right?
Mhm.
Or if they only helped China or Russia or whatever, like what would happen to the world? You could see why that thought would arise, right? That they
Mhm.
would not want to influence anybody. But just to kind of like, put a bow on what I'm saying here, I think that they would want to preserve life, and I think that they would want to study life.
Mhm. Yeah, my thought is that they would probably feel similarly to how we feel, in that we have just appeared here, and if they are conscious as we are conscious, the inevitable thought is, what the fuck is all this? What is going on? Why are we here? What does this mean? Does it mean anything? And I think just in that natural, seemingly natural, I guess we do take it for granted because of our own frame of reference, but seemingly natural desire for conscious beings to uh want to find some order, meaning, what have you, about what reality is. They would be interested to find others who were grappling with that same thing. I think that is part of our motivation for trying to find others, is to understand what it all is. Why is it? Is there any meaning here? Is it just chance? Like, it's really, I think that would be probably the most the most likely reason that they would want to seek us out and eventually interact with us. And I think just as we would have some trepidation about approaching them directly, being unsure of what their consciousness is like, what their moral values are like, if that's even a concept to them, they would want to be very uh careful about it. But I think that if they had the technology to come here and study, interact, I think it would be a no-brainer that they would want to do it. They would just want to be careful about it. And that's probably a big reason why, if they exist, and if we're thinking about this, if we're going with this thought experiment that they do exist, that they would approach us in a somewhat secretive way, to try and keep themselves at a distance, to mitigate their influence on us, to see what we're like, to see if we have connection. Um, yeah, I think, and also I just want to take this moment, and I know I said I wasn't going to mention it that much, but everyone should read Three Body Problem, the series by Shishin Liu, because it is an excellent, it's one of the best uh thought experiments and stories about our interaction with extraterrestrial civilizations. And I think it has a lot of interesting thoughts about maybe why we haven't heard from other civilizations, and how there might be some uh fear of interacting with another civilization. I won't go too deeply into it, but it examines the idea of this thing called the dark forest theory, and it's a plausible theory for why, if we are to communicate and put ourselves out there to other civilizations, why we should be careful doing so. I think we have maybe this planned as a whole nother episode, so I won't dive too deeply into it now, but those are my thoughts on what they might be thinking and why they might be approaching us in the way that they have, if this is in fact another civilization.
Didn't Stephen Hawking say something ominous like before he died about cautioning humanity from being too eager to shout out into the abyss of space?
I'm not sure. Let me see if I can
It
find
just it
anything.
I don't have anything pulled up on that, but what you were just saying, and yes, I will be reading this series. I promise you, I will. You sold
Oh,
me on it.
please, please, please! It is
I,
incredible. It's
I
incredible.
will. I will. You have me kind of hyped on it now. I definitely will. But
Mhm.
I seem to recall in the years preceding Stephen Hawking's death, him saying something about cautioning humanity about being too eager to just loudly proclaim our existence outward in every direction into space. Um, Go ahead, please.
Well, what's funny about this is, if he did in fact say that, we blatantly ignored him, because I'm reading an article on The Guardian right now saying that Stephen Hawking's voice to be beamed into space at final send-off.
Oh
So,
God.
so if that is in fact what he said, we have really, really fucked him here.
Oh my God. Oh
I
Lord,
mean, that
I
would be
need
the
to.
most ironic act that is possible. It's so funny.
I mean, we're sending Teslas into space. I mean, we're definitely not being quiet.
Right.
Okay, yeah. So Stephen Hawking thinks that making contact with aliens would be a very bad idea indeed. This is according to the Guardian. Too dangerous. Yeah, there's several articles. I typed this up. He went on record as saying it could be too dangerous for humans to interact with extraterrestrials at all.
So, who the fuck made the decision to do this?
I don't know.
It says
Oh,
here,
man.
quote, the broadcast will be beamed towards the nearest black hole, 1A0620-00, which lives in a binary system with fairly ordinary orange dwarf star. That's from his daughter.
And
So
what
I guess
voice
they
are
didn't take him
beaming?
too seriously.
Are they beaming like the
Oh
computer
my
voice
God.
or like his original voice or?
That's a good question. Man, the
Ugh.
irony of that situation is just, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
wow. Sorry, Steve.
It's all his fault when they come knocking on our door.
Right.
Oh Lord.
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, I really want to. Oh man, I really want to talk about Three Body Problem because it's so pertinent here. But I would just implore you and the audience to read it because
I will. I will.
it is an excellent, excellent thought about this concept of why we may have not heard from any civilizations and why we should be cautious about this.
Hmm.
But let's move on because I think, like I said, we will probably discuss this whole theory and idea in a full episode. It is definitely would require it, I think.
Mhm.
Going back to this thought experiment, do we? I've seen some people speculate that they may be interested in our resources or potentially making us into some sort of zoo or subservient species. Do you guys think that there's any potential credence to that theory?
I don't know about credence. It's a fun thought experiment. See, this is another thing I didn't want to bring up. I'd agreed not to bring it up with Alex earlier because this is like this because we see the nature of this conversation is so sprawling.
Right.
But Alex, immediately when Brandon mentioned this, I thought of because I don't think I've talked to you about this, Brandon. But Alex and I have gone down this rabbit hole of this guy, and I cannot remember his name to save my life. But he was in the military, and he made these really outlandish claims about encountering a UFO in the Philippines. I really don't want to dive into it too much because this should be for another episode. But basically, the too long did not read bit of this is that this gentleman claimed that the United States government was funneling humans, like human trafficking, essentially giving human beings to the aliens. I don't know if and he didn't elaborate because he himself he claimed he didn't know what for, but or he didn't make any claim for what the purpose was, but it seemed like for some sort of like harvesting or study or something.
Interesting. So maybe the biblical sacrifices were at the hand of those who were trying to appease our alien overlords the whole time.
Yeah, right. Now, as ridiculous as it sounds, and again, I don't want to dive into this one on this episode because it's a whole thing in and of itself. But Alex, help me out here. Do you remember the gentleman's name that I'm referring to?
I don't remember his name, but how you described what the aliens were doing is pretty accurate from my memory. And I think you see this a lot, and I think you can kind of draw a parallel to if you guys have seen like any of like cattle mutilation, right? That's like something that's common when like looking at aliens visiting Earth. Like there's all these strange, and we could get into that. Maybe we should have this week, but there's a lot of people claiming that they're mutilating cattle for different reasons. If you believe that, it's definitely not a very far extrapolation at all to think that they'd be doing the same thing to humans. I will say that the story that this guy gives that Chops is referring to is wild. We definitely
Ooh.
should talk about it at some time because it is just absolutely crazy.
Michael Herrera. He's a former Marine, and it is as Alex just said, it's absolutely bonkers the story that he tells.
We'll add him to the list of topics, and maybe we can get into some of the Dark Forest theory stuff, and like maybe we can have an whole episode about what if, they're using us or they're evil or something like that. That sounds interesting, though. I'm very curious to learn more.
Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for him. But when we inevitably do another episode on extraterrestrials, I'll definitely have a write up ready for this guy, and we'll dive into it. So
awesome. So let's try and start wrapping this up. I think one last thing I wanted to talk about before we go is let's go through one more thought experiment. Let's say all of the things that we've discussed, the evidence is all real, and that it is in fact true that we have been visited by some other species and whatever. How do you guys think that we should conduct our daily lives? Should we change how we live at all? Should we continue as is? What should we do on an individual level and maybe even as a societal level, knowing that we are not alone and that we've been visited?
Well,
you go first,
go
Alex.
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it makes me think that maybe I don't want to sound like I'm calling for a new world order here. It's usually when that discussion, which should be another episode, should be about the new world order. That is usually seen as a nefarious, gravely negative thing that could happen to humanity. But it seems to me like if we can determine that we are not alone in this universe, and not only are we not alone, but the other entities that are out there are intelligent and potentially have intelligence that far surpasses what we're capable of. I would say that as a planet, as a race, as a species, it behooves us to get along, and maybe the dissolution of countries to in some manifestation dissolving separate governments and uniting under one would maybe be a good thing. The gist of it is to stop squabbling and warring amongst ourselves. On an individual level, that's a fantastic question too. I haven't formulated a full thought on that, and I'll leave the floor to two of you.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I think we should, if that were the case, in this thought experiment, I think it would make sense for us as the public to demand access to these technologies. Because, I mean, there's a lot of problems in today's world that seem to be able to be solved by, just superior technology, whether that's like energy usage or it's just human safety in general. So I would think that we as a society should demand that we have access to these things and that they're used for us and not against us. I think that would be the real tragic thing, is if they were used against us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think you guys raised some good points. I think I totally agree with like us starting to look at ourselves as a global society. Honestly, I personally think that that's probably how we should start to think about the world anyway. And I also agree that we should know, because ultimately my the root of everything for me is always trying to determine what is all this, and my desire to understand the universe and to understand our place in it, and what if it means anything that is. And I think those are really good points. From a personal level, I think that if there were something tomorrow that came out that this was all real, aliens are here, they have an interest in us. I think I it would probably be hard to take at first, just from what we've mentioned before, the destabilizing factor of it all. But I think ultimately the kind of west or eastern philosophical view of the world is still the best way to approach everything, in that we all we have is what we can control and what we can experience in our own consciousness, and to just accept that if in fact there is something greater than us, or we are a part of a universal society and we have a place in it, that we should just continue to live in a way that, values our subjective experience of it all, and to do the best that we can to make one step at a time to benefit everybody involved, including other species. And I think we should really be careful as a society to make sure that if in fact we do come into contact with another civilization, that we try and communicate with them in a way that uh would show them that we are all in this together and we want to figure this out together, and we have things that we can learn from each other and teach each other. And from my day-to-day life, I'm just going to continue to focus on the things that I can control, which is what I am doing in every present moment. And for me, that's like the ultimate peaceful philosophy. It's like acceptance of the fact that just by nature of us existing and being able to comprehend all this stuff around us, we we have to just move forward. And I think that's, for me, would be the biggest piece of solace in all this, and would allow me to continue my day-to-day life, is just accepting that it is what it is, and dealing with things one step at a time. And to try, and I feel like I would just be super excited. I would be super excited to know. And if it is some civilization that has technology that at the snap of their fingers could wipe us all out, then we're gone. And there's nothing we can do about it anyway. So why worry about it? And I think we should just try and make every effort we can on an individual and societal level to promote disclosure if there is secrets being held, and to try and move forward in a way that promotes working together and trying to understand. So, yeah.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I wonder, I can't see my personal life changing too drastically,
Mhm.
unless the revelations come out and alien technology and alien species begin to integrate into our lives more. Than who knows? Sky's the limit for how different our personal lives can end up looking, right?
Right.
But yeah, I think on a day-to-day level, once you get over the initial like smack in the face shock of the reality of it, I would imagine my life would continue on much as it has. Just being grateful for this weird, trippy life that I get to live.
Yep. Which would become magnitudes more trippy.
Yeah, wouldn't it though? And I mean, who knows, man? We could be there, and it's just not officially out yet. I mean,
Right.
we could actually be there.
I want to believe. Cool. Well, anything else you guys want to add?
No.
No.
All right. To our listeners out there, thank you for joining us in discussing these difficult and mysterious topics. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and will think deeply regarding some of the implications or fallacies surrounding these topics. If you have anything to add, corrections, comments, thoughts, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. This has been Mystery School Dropouts with hosts myself, Brandon, Chops, and Alex. Until next time, keep questioning, keep examining, and keep seeking the truth, no matter how strange.